So here's a bit of a roadmap for what we'll be doing today. We'll be going over just some like basic semantic foundations. So one of the things that we need to consider when we're doing semantic analyses, then we're going to go over specifically things about the lexicon. So, some semantics is done inside of the lexicon, some semantics is done outside of the lexicon, and we will talk about that distinction. Then we'll talk about what I'm calling compositional principles. So this is basically how words combine with one another and what that does to how we interpret words. And then we'll go over a Hebrew example and a Greek example and finish with some questions. Okay, so again, if you have any questions or just need me to explain something that I'm not explaining well during the presentation, stop me and we can go over it. Okay, so these are just some basic things that you would learn in a sort of introductory semantics textbook, but they're really important. They're important enough to go over again if you've already read a semantics textbook, or really just if you're kind of new to semantics in general. They're just foundational concepts. So the first one, very broadly speaking, right? People distinguish between two kinds of meaning, and one kind of meaning is often associated with the field of semantics. The other kind of meaning is often associated with the field of pragmatics. Okay, so entailment is normally associated with semantics. I just gave a definition here. So meaning components that are necessarily true when a word is used. Okay, so if you think about the word man, for example, if you call someone a man, they are also necessarily a human. Okay. Sorry, just a quick note on this as well. This is being recorded. We will probably post this on YouTube and other places. I don't know what Nick is going to do with it, but so you can watch it again if you would like. So entailment has to do with in semantics what are called truth conditions. It just means that what is true and false. Okay, so if you say if you call someone a man, you say I'm a man, then and that is true, then it is also necessarily true that I am a human, right? That's the idea. Then we have another kind of meaning, this is also a meaning, but it is different, right? It has different properties, called an implicature. And this is my definition: meaning components that hold in a specific context when the word is used. Okay, so when I say something like Nick found $20, we infer from this that it previously wasn't his, right? In an out of blue context, if I just say Nick found $20, that's what we would normally understand. That doesn't necessarily hold, right? It's not necessarily true that $20 he found wasn't his, but it's just that we have this inference, basically coming from the word found, that what he found was not previously his, and this is cancelable. So given the right context, this inference will not hold, right? So this is implicature, and it's in the field of pragmatics. Okay, so the whole point of this, right, is that not all meaning in lexical items will hold in every context, right? That's what we have to be careful of. Okay, so next we can talk about senses. So this is honestly, I hesitated to even put this in here because it's such a slippery word, and there are so many people that know way more about lexical semantics than I do that really don't fully understand what a sense is, even though we kind of know it exists intuitively. So I'm just defining it as distinct interpretations of a word that are logically related. So the reason why this is so difficult to define is because it's very difficult to figure out sometimes whether you have a truly distinct sense of a word, or whether the context is just giving you a meaning, right? And it's not actually the word that's giving you that meaning. So I'll give you an example. Tina is drinking out back. This is ambiguous, right? There are two readings for this. The sort of default reading is Tina is drinking alcohol out back, right? Out of the blue context. But it's obviously not the case that it has to be alcohol, right? If we said, if everyone had, I don't know, orange juice that they were drinking, and they were all drinking in different places, and someone asks, where's Tina drinking? Oh, Tina's drinking out back, right? That's a totally fine sentence. So the question is whether these are two different senses of the word drinking. It is two different interpretations. One is specific to drinking alcohol. One is drinking anything. It really depends on how you define sense. But for now, for our purposes, we'll just call them, they're two distinct interpretations. But just keep in mind that this really does, like, if you read in the semantics literature, how you define sense will often determine what senses you find, right? Okay, and the important thing about this is that syntax and context help to disambiguate senses. Give me 1 second. Well, go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you. So is I know you're trying to be careful about differentiating sense and meaning, but is the main difference? Does it have to do with whether the difference is related to the lexical form itself, or whether it's contextually determined? Is that kind of the difference between a different meaning and a different sense?
I would define meaning much more broadly. So you can have like meanings that arise. So like I said about implicatures, right? Those are meanings, but I wouldn't call those that a different sense of a lexical item, right? So if we it's very difficult to like parse this out, right? This is actually part of the problem. This is part of the reason why it's so tricky with like how you define sense, right? So you could define, you could in a dictionary put in two different senses of find and say there's one sense of find, that has that implies that you didn't own the thing before, and one sense that implies that you did own the thing before, right? But the problem is how, if we start doing that, then where do we draw the line on, what does the word mean versus what context is the word found in, right? So the problem is, I would say that like meaning has to do with interpretation, right? And so we can interpret those things differently. Where that meaning comes from, right, is I would say is the sense, right? So if a verb has a truly distinct sense of a word, if a verb has a truly two truly distinct senses, then that word can contribute two distinct things to a context, right? Whereas even if they might be logically related, but it's a different contribution. Whereas a meaning can just be meanings can arise from almost anything in that context, right? Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I know it's hard, but thanks, Kevin.
Yeah. So here's an example of how syntax and context can help to disambiguate senses, right? So this is very normal, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Just that nouns that are formed from verbs often have at least two distinct senses. Okay, so you can refer to an event that's related to the verb, or you can refer to the thing that's created from the event, right? So the creation of one shirt takes a long time to perfect. So that is a noun, creation, that's referring to an event of creating, right? And we know this, right? Because the context makes it clear. we can talk about the length of time, right, that event takes place. And we also have the object of the creating event, one shirt, right? Whereas if you look at the next example, the creation is rebelling against the creator, right? Here it's clear that the creation is not referring to an event, but the thing that is created, that is created, right? It's the thing that is created from the event. So in this case, the creation doesn't have like a normal, like an object, right? Whereas the creation in the first example, the creation of one shirt is the object. In the second example, there's no object, right? And so that leads us to interpret it as, and there's no time associated with it either. And those things lead us to interpret it as an actual thing in the world, right? Rather than an event. That's the idea. And so we do this automatically all the time. There are so many different ways that we disambiguate senses. This is just, one example of many, many, many that we could talk about, where, it's been noticed in the literature and talked about a lot that you have these different senses with these kinds of nouns. Okay, and then another important point is that meaning often overlaps, but is rarely identical, rarely or never. So what I mean by this is that when you're looking at when you're analyzing something, right, and you're looking at like synonymous words, like so-called synonyms, the assumption is that there are some contexts that they will both fit in, and then there are other contexts that they won't both fit in. And that's the reason is simply because it would be pointless for us to have a word that, or two words that can occur in every single context in the same way, right? It just wouldn't be economical in language, right? So we often just make slight distinctions based on all kinds of little things. So here's an example that I don't know, I think about when I'm signing into my bank account and stuff. So some websites will say sign in, and some websites say sign on, right? So sign in, to me, presupposes you have an account, right? You can't sign into something if you don't already have an account. Sign on, again, under my like just native speaker intuition, says you may or may not have an account. So I think you could sign on to something for the first time, right? Or you could sign on, and you not previously have that thing, right? But sign up presupposes you don't have the thing. So these are like very like subtle distinctions that we kind of get intuitively. But you can see overlap, right? Especially between sign in and sign on. The assumption though is that they're not the same. And if you did a word study on this, and I haven't done it, I don't know if anyone has, but you would probably find that there are some places where sign on works, and sign in does not, and vice versa, right? And the same thing with sign up. So the point in this is just preparing ourselves for how we're going to think about our analyses and what we're looking for. Okay, so the lexicon. So we can do semantics on a lot of different things, right? So we can do semantics on, like, if you have listened to our podcast on the verbal system, the verbal system is not the lexicon, right? People would not define that as part of the lexicon. It's part of the grammar, right? So this lexical semantics is semantics about the or on the lexicon. Okay, so we can call like levels of the lexicon. So first we have roots. So people, especially who do Hebrew, they're often introduced to the idea of roots when they look at Hebrew. But that's I mean, yeah, everyone that I've heard talk about roots in linguistics would assume that roots are universal. So every language has roots. Okay. And they're manifested in different ways, and they have different properties in different languages. So in English, for example, roots look like words. Okay. That's not the same in Hebrew. There is no such thing in Hebrew as a root that is identical to a word, because roots only have consonants and don't have vowels. Okay. So roots are going to do different things in different languages, but they're always going to carry the lexical information, the conceptual content, right? So we talked about this a little bit with Malka. I think like the dog ran into the room or something. Where the dog, right? The is giving grammatical information, logical information, and dog is carrying conceptual content there. So roots are often very abstract. So I have this root here, Gimel Dalet Lamed. You can form all kinds of words with this root in Hebrew. And they all have to do something with big, right? Bigness or size. Sometimes they're much more specific. For example, elephant is, you often can't form a verb out of elephant, right? Or an adjective. Even though you can form a verb, adjective, and noun out of Gimel Dalet Lamed, right? That root in Hebrew. So depending on the characteristics of the root, it may or may not combine with what are called categorizers. So categorizers take a root and they give you a word, right? They give you a grammatical category for that root. So you can see this here on the tree on the right. So this is the root, like shafat. This is just like pulled from my dissertation, just so you can see. We'll just talk about a few of these. So the root shafat combines with a thing that gives it a category, right? The binyan system is a system of categorizers and voice, which is not, which we're not going to talk about right now. But this is a specific kind of categorizer with a specific meaning, right? So you have the root that combines with this vowel pattern, and it spits you out a word, right? Shafat. Okay. So what's important is that roots are not the same as words. And this is often in the literature not talked about precisely enough. Okay. So the reason being, like, you can't, there are all kinds of arguments that are made about lexical items that share the same root, that often don't work, right? Because roots are, as I said, often very abstract. So you need to be very careful about how you, if you're comparing two words with the same root, what kinds of things, right, will they have in common, and what kinds of things won't they have in common is the big question, right? And which we're not going to answer right now. So words. Then we have words. So what is a word? It's actually really not easy to define, and there's a lot of debate about it. But for our purposes, we'll just say it's a phonological unit which carries a specific meaning. So, again, this root will combine with what's called a categorizer, something that makes a root into a word, right? And that word has a specific grammatical category, right? So in this case, shafat would be to make a ruling or judge, or and that is a phonological unit with a specific meaning. Okay. And it has a grammatical category of verb. So words can have what are called arguments associated with them. So again, this is something that I talk about quite frequently, but if you're not into the linguistics literature, you might not have heard this term argument. Basically, it's another word. It's another word that completes the thought of a word. So if you think about a word like run, there has to be someone running. So the runner is an argument of the verb run. Okay, so when you form a word, and sometimes roots can have arguments associated with them as well. That's debatable. I think they can, but and that would obviously have implications for your analysis of all the words that are formed from those roots. But the idea here is just that, there are certain concepts that words can that we can use with words, and those concepts are necessarily relational. So like brother, right? You're always the brother of someone, right? Runners, like running always has a runner, right? Those kinds of things. These concepts are necessarily have something else to go with them. Okay. So that's just a little bit about words. And then we have word classes. So word classes, you can do this in a lot of different ways. What's quite popular is to do it with semantic domain. So to sort of take a group of words, right, and say, okay, let's talk about all the rooms in a house, and just say, this is a class of words, and that can be helpful in certain ways. I think what's more important and what's more interesting is shared syntactic characteristics. So the idea is that there are certain meaning components in words that have grammatical consequences, right? So in other words, and we're about to see this, there are some words that will do certain things differently in the grammar, and there's a whole class of them that'll behave the same way, right? So I have an example here. Verbs with a single argument, which has the action performed on it, right? Some of these are called unaccusatives. So I have this example: the vase broke, cracked, shattered, versus the vase hit, touched, knocked, right? So you can say, perfect, fine, the vase broke, or it cracked, or it shattered, right? It's very odd to say the vase hit. It's just weird, right? So the question is why? Like you might put break and hit in the same semantic domain, right? If depending on how you divided them up, but syntactically they actually behave quite differently. And so what that tells us is that these two words have something in their meaning that is leading them to be allowed in one syntactic context and disallowed in another syntactic context. Okay, and we'll get to more of this, but this, I think, is really the best thing we have for figuring out the meaning of words. One of the best things we have for figuring out the meaning of words in Hebrew and Greek, because you have syntax, right? You have it's just written down. You don't have native speaker intuitions, right? So it's easy to say, let's just ask someone, right, what this English word means, even though native speakers will often get that wrong. But they will know how the word is used, right? And we just know the vase hit is just bad in an out of the blue context. It's just weird, right? And so we'll just never say it. So the fact that we do have data, syntactic data on how verbs and adjectives and nouns are used, right, can really help us to figure out what these words actually mean. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of this. So compositional principles, basically what I mean by this is just that words are going to combine with grammatical morphemes in different ways, right? Give me 1 second, Joseph. And then that's going to have consequences, right, for how we interpret these words. Go ahead.
So if I say something like, the man threw the vase across the room and the vase hit the wall, then if I add an accusative, the vase hit the wall, it's perfectly fine then, right?
Yep, for sure.
But if we just leave it as just simply the vase hit, then you're left going, wait, come on, tell me some more. That's incomplete.
For sure. And you have to be you have to be very careful, right? Because there could be, you could say, like, you could have a context like, okay, everything in the dining room hit the ground, right? And then someone could ask, did the vase hit? And you could say, yeah, the vase hit too, right? Or yes, the vase hit, right? But there, the lack of object is different than the lack of object in the vase broke, right? Because there we know from context that we're actually supplying the ground, right? So what you have to be very careful of, right, is that on the surface that might be a counterexample, right? But it's really not, because the context is actually supplying the accusative there, and we know that in language we can just drop those things when it's just understood, right? So that's why you just have to be you have to pay a lot of attention to the context in which these things are found. And that's why I said at the beginning, out of blue context, right, the vase hit versus the vase broke are two clearly different things.
This would probably mean that if you're collecting data from Hebrew poetry where there's ellipsis, you have to be careful to note that what you think is an example for your data might not actually be a good example.
Yeah.
When you remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be just Hebrew poetry. It'd be, just language in general is going to have ellipsis. Poetry even more. So, right, I think is your point. But yes. And the reality is that these kinds of contexts are, not very common, right? It's not, if you looked at a corpus in English, I'm sure like the amount of times you would see, the vase hit or something like that would be very, very small. Even though we can come up with contexts where it works, it's still like, so where we see these like large patterns of like, okay, every time but three, this is what happens. Then we have to ask ourselves, can we explain these three, right? With something in the context. Great. So right. So when we're analyzing words, so the main three syntactic categories, verb, noun, adjective, we what are some of the things that we need to consider? So like with a noun, nouns are going to combine with determiners. And determiners are things like a, the, some, many. So they are going to do different things depending on the properties of the noun. So here's just some examples. If I said Nick ate an apple when he played lacrosse, that's totally fine, right? And we normally interpret that to mean he ate, a single apple when he played lacrosse one time, right? Although I think that you probably interpret that as habitual. Nick ate apples when he played lacrosse. That is normally habitual, right? So just notice here, right, that nothing changed between these two sentences, except for an apple versus apples. And in one case, the verb is interpreted habitually. In the second case, in the other case, it's not, right? So the point is that you have to be very, very careful, right? If you're going to do semantics of verbs, right, you have to do nouns. You actually absolutely have to. And you can't, you just can't do one without the other. Nick ate the apple when he played lacrosse. That really only allows one event. Whereas Nick ate an apple when he played lacrosse, you could probably interpret that habitually. Nick ate apple when he played lacrosse, you would probably never say. It would be very, very odd. So I have a little. So in linguistics, if you haven't seen this before, the little question mark at the beginning is like, well, like maybe you could think of a context that would be okay in, but probably not. Or you can put an asterisk, which just says like that's grammatically bad. Sometimes a hashtag as well. Nick ate a fruit when he played lacrosse. Again, so like Nick ate a fruit when he played lacrosse. It's like, okay, maybe you could say that. You would pretty much always say a piece of fruit. Fruit really doesn't like to be left alone like that. And it also doesn't like the plural, right? Nick ate fruits when he played lacrosse. Again, you could say, okay, Nick ate different kinds of fruits, right? And that would be the only possible interpretation of that. But you wouldn't normally say that, right? Nick ate the fruit when he played lacrosse. Perfectly fine. Nick ate fruit when he played lacrosse. Again, perfectly fine. So it's interesting here, right? We have the bare singular, right? Without the article, without the indefinite article. Nick ate fruit when he played lacrosse. Again, it's interpreted habitually, and it's parallel to the plural, right? So bare singular, in this case, is interpreted in a very similar way to a bare plural, right? Just a count noun with a plural, right? Because fruit is what's called a mass noun, right? The point of all this is just to say that the semantics of the word apple or fruit, right? They're very close, right? They were probably put in the same semantic domain, or at least apple is a subset, right? It's a kind of fruit. Syntactically, they're very different. They have different properties that do quite different things, and they interact with verbs in a different way. So just an aside on this, if you've read commentaries, for example, on the article, right? The thing is that in English, we have an indefinite article. We have a, right? And Hebrew and Greek, they kind of have a quasi indefinite article, but they really don't. Not in the same way. It's not obligatory like it is in English. Well, English isn't really obligatory, right? Because you can see it with fruit, right? But people call it obligatory. But the point is that saying something like, oh, the article isn't here in this example, so it's a whatever and not the, right? That's incorrect, right? It's just wrong. The issue is that it's way more complex, right? It depends on the characteristics of the noun, right? And it depends on the whole system, right? In Greek and Hebrew are different because they don't have the word a, and a is contributing something. In fact, a here, doesn't combine with the mass noun just like the plural does. And that's a pretty typical analysis of a, is it's doing something close to what the plural is doing. But because Greek and Hebrew don't have that, you are going to the bare singular is going to overlap sometimes with our definite article the, and sometimes with our indefinite article a, right? And so you can't conclude things from just not seeing the article. It's just way too simplistic. Sorry, it's just a little rant I had to go on there. Okay, adjectives. So what are you going to be looking for if you're looking at adjectives? So here's just an example of some of the complexities involved. Nick's hands are dry. There are two readings of this. Can anyone tell me the two readings of Nick's hands are dry?
It can have to do with wetness and dryness, or it might have to just do with the skin being dry.
I think you're right, but I need to can you explain a little bit more?
So it could be, Nick's hands are dry as opposed to wet, or it could be the skin is flaky and dry and it's cracking as opposed to the skin is moist and healthy and has nothing to do with water moisture, for example.
Right. So I think what you're saying is that it's a it's either a property of the hands, right? Or it's a property of a specific time period. So like it to say that his hands are dry could mean like in this moment his hands are dry, they're not wet, right? Or it could be that Nick's hands have the property of being dry, right? So even if they're wet in this moment, his hands are still dry in that sense, right? Because his hands are like just dry hands rather than clammy or moist hands.
Well, I was thinking in terms of the two ways it can have to do with the property on the surface of Nick's hands. So whether there's water on the hand, or it had to do with the property inside the hand. So like the actual skin inside. So whether it can be at a specific time or not. But yours works too. That's a different. I wasn't thinking about that.
Okay, yeah. So the one I gave is the like the one talked about in the literature.
Got it. Yeah.
Yours is the creative one. So if you contrast that with the Sahara Desert is dry, right? The Sahara Desert is dry does not have the reading where it means like it's currently at this time not wet, right? It means that in general it's dry, right? It's a very dry place, right? It's saying that desert has a property of dryness, right? Just like Nick's hands are, like notoriously dry, right? That's the idea. The point of this, so there's a reason for this is a lot that could be said about it. It has to do with the scales that the scale that this adjective is contributing, and how that interacts with in this case hands versus deserts. But the point is that again, you have to be very careful, right, about what kind of about the context, right, and the specific semantics of a very simple word like dry, right, because it will change based on what you're predicating dry of. So here's another example. Rachel is a beautiful dancer. What are the two readings there?
That Rachel is beautiful, or that her dancing is beautiful.
Right. Sorry, Hannah. You can have the next one. So that Rachel is both beautiful and a dancer, right? Or that Rachel's dancing is beautiful. So this doesn't work, right? For any noun. So if you said Rachel is a beautiful girl, you don't get the two readings. So you have to have something, dancer has a certain property, right, that interacts with beautiful in a way that's different, right? So again, if you change it to let's say good, Rachel is a good dancer. I don't get two readings. I only get one. I don't know. I mean, at least it would be very hard to think. You wouldn't ever really interpret Rachel's a good dancer to mean Rachel's a good person and she is a dancer, right? And then Rachel's a good girl. Again, you only have one reading. So the point of this, right, is just to show with these minimal pairs that you need to be careful about the subtle differences in meaning with the words surrounding these words, right? So if you were doing analysis on beautiful, you have to figure out, okay, why does beautiful allow this? Why does good not, right? And what kinds of contexts does what kinds of words can you put here where you get this double reading, right? Rachel is a beautiful, I don't know, cook. Do you get that? I don't know. But the I mean, that's actually a really interesting example, which is a beautiful cook. Yeah, I think no. I mean, you can't think of like her being beautifully cooking, right? So what you need is probably some sort of event where you can do it beautifully, right? But the point is that you just need to be, there's a lot of homework you need to do if you're going to analyze beautiful, right? About the words around them, around the word beautiful, that you would have to figure out, what exactly they mean. So if you want to know what beautiful means, you need to know the proper semantics of dancer as well, and how that differs from cook. Okay, another one, verbs, and then we'll get into Hebrew and Greek. So Nick gave Rachel a cookie. Has one reading. Rachel now has the cookie. Nick gave a cookie to Rachel. Again, one reading. Nick threw Rachel a cookie. One reading. Nick threw a cookie to Rachel. Does Rachel have the cookie? What do you think?
Not necessarily. She could have it, or he could have thrown it, but it didn't make it to her.
Right. So that's those are the two readings, right? This is called the dative alternation in English. A ton has been written on it. And what's interesting, right, is that give behaves differently. If you say Nick gave a cookie to Rachel, Rachel has to have the cookie. But the fact that you have this same alternation with the verb, the putting the dative here, right, versus the preposition with give and throw, but you have two different interpretations, right, with a verb like throw, suggests that give and throw belong to the same class of verbs, in the sense that they both can undergo the dative alternation, right? But within that class, there are subclasses, right? There's a class of verbs that have this double reading with the to variant, and there's a class of verbs that don't have that double reading with the to variant, right? So again, the important thing here is you need to be very careful about parsing out exactly what these things mean. So now I'll give you some examples. These are things that I've worked on a lot. Hopefully, I've talked about them before, not really in any sort of depth. So hopefully they will be new and exciting for you. So this is like stuff I've been working on in my dissertation, right? So what does tzadek? So those of you that don't do Hebrew, this is the verb for righteous or just, innocent. I don't know however you want to translate it. I have translated it innocent, and I'll tell you why in a second. So the first question is like, what in the world does this thing mean? The second is, what is the difference between the verbal form tzadek and the adjective tzaddik? So this is not simple, because you have contexts where they seem to be pretty interchangeable, and we will get to that. Okay, so first, like, what would I do if I was trying to figure out what this word means? This is just like literally from my Excel spreadsheet, just like copied and pasted it, and I like deleted a bunch of columns. But this is what I do for when I'm like studying a word, right? I go through, and what you don't see is like all the blank columns that have to do with the like syntactic context in which the word is found. So I'll note, okay, is there a prepositional complement, right? Is there an adjunct, right? All of these things, right? Is there a direct object? Is there, a genitive if it's a noun, right? What kinds of things is it modifying if it's an adjective? Is it used predicatively, like, Nick is righteous, or attributively, like the righteous Nick, right? So all kinds of things I would list out, and then I would try to interpret it, right? So I have the sense here, and if you look, I have these two examples that are tricky, right? I'm like, okay, I think in every single case, it means innocent. And by innocent, what I mean is that the verb means that in a particular instance, that person doesn't have fault, right? Or in a particular instance, that person is righteous, right? So it doesn't mean that in general this person is righteous, right? That's the claim, okay? At least, this is what I think you can find based on the data. But there's these two examples that are like, I don't really know what to do with them. Okay, so let's just look at them and see what we can do. So I'll just, because I'm not really sure how many of you are comfortable with reading Hebrew, I'll just read the English translation. I just took the ESV. So we have, bear your disgrace, you also, for you have intervened on behalf of your sisters because of your sins in which you acted more abominably than they. They are more in the right than you, right? So this is what we're actually talking about. Titzdakna mimech. Okay, so this is this last line at the end. Again, I'm just taking this from the ESV. So what's special about this here? So this is talking about Jerusalem, right? And how her sins are greater than her sisters Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. And then it says Titzdakna mimech, right? The mimech is giving you the comparative. Okay. So what if you've done any research on the semantics of adjectives, you know that comparatives are special. They're special because they create kind of artificial boundaries to I don't know how to explain this without explaining a whole lot of things about scales. Okay, so if you think about yeah, there are only some there. Trying to think about. Okay, so you wouldn't ordinarily say more innocent, right? This is why this reading is weird, right? And this is why, I in my notes, right, I said innocent doesn't really work, right? And the reason is because innocent as an adjective, like has certain scalar properties that doesn't really allow it to combine well with the comparative, right? And so what you get when you have the comparative with those kinds of adjectives is you get some sort of like weird reading, right? So if you said, Nick is more innocent than Kevin, you would say, okay, well, they're probably both guilty, right? But Kevin is more guilty, right? That's what you would include when you said Nick is more innocent. But and that's ironically, right? That's exactly the kind of context we have here. So the point is that this kind of context is not a normal context, right? A comparative. It's a syntactic context that is unique and that's been studied in all kinds of different ways. But it does something. It allows some adjectives and it doesn't allow some adjectives to go into it. Or it creates some sort of special interpretation, right, with the adjective. And again, I'm not going to get I can get into the details, but I don't think we have a ton of time. Yeah. So I'm going to refrain. You can ask questions at the end if you really want to know some of the details on this. But here's the point, right? If we have all these examples here, if we have all these examples and then, we have this one counterexample that is a comparative, right? Is that really a counterexample, right? And if it's in a context where, the person is still guilty, right? More innocent is still guilty. Then we we know, or this really isn't a counterexample to our hypothesis that, maybe this verb means innocent. Okay. This is a harder example, I think. The last line, Tzadku Yachtav. So it's talking about, if you look at the translation, the rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So if with this translation, like it's really hard to get the reading I'm talking about. Okay. The temporal reading, right? The fact that like the rules are righteous in a particular time period and not at all times, right? It's very hard to get. In fact, it's not possible because of the semantics of the word rule. Okay, if you replaced it with the rulings of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, I think it's fine, right? In the sense that righteous here would then mean each occurrence of the ruling, every time a ruling is made, that ruling has the property of being righteous. But it doesn't mean that the rule itself is always righteous. Okay, because rulings come and go, right? They're instantaneous, right? And they're just like they're something that's created at a certain time period, right? Whereas rules are stable, they're permanent, right? Or they aren't created and discarded in the same way. So the idea here is that if you have a different semantics for mishpat, which I think you should, then tzadku here is totally fine. Okay. So that would mean that this is not a counterexample. Even though it's different, right? It is different because rulings can't be innocent. But they can be, let's say righteous for a certain time period, right? Whenever they're created, they're righteous, right? That's the idea. So again, we can explain then these two counterexamples to the sense of tzadek, right? By the syntactic context. What we wouldn't expect is like this, some context in Job, right? Where or let's say the Psalms, right? Where God's talking about himself abstractly and he just says like tzadakti, right? I'm righteous, right? We just that kind of thing. We would say, okay, that would be like a really good counterexample. And I would say, this hypothesis is probably wrong. But we can explain these two counterexamples with the nature of the argument, mishpatim, right? We just say, oh, maybe this word means rulings, something that's temporal, and not something that's permanent, like a rule. And maybe the comparative in Ezekiel is doing something that allows us to use tzadku in a different way. Okay. Now, how does this relate to tzaddik, the adjective? You have examples where tzaddik is innocent, just like in with the verb, right? Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, right? Chatati hapam Adonai hatzadik vani ve'ami hareshaim. I have sinned this time. Yahweh is the innocent one, right? Adonai hatzadik. And my people and I are the guilty ones. So it's very clear from this context that it's talking about a specific instance, right? I have sinned this time. Okay. It's not talking about God being righteous in general. So my hypothesis is that, so these are exactly the kinds of contexts, right? Where we could have the verb, right? Where the verb would be acceptable. You could also say Adonai tzadek, right? I think that would be fine here. Again, the fact that you have the adjective senses overlap, right? This is totally fine. There are all kinds of contexts like this, right? Where you do have the verb. Okay. But then in Psalm 116:5, we have a different kind of context. Hanun Adonai v'tzadik ve'Eloheinu merachem. Adonai is merciful and righteous. Our God shows compassion. So this is the kind of context where you find the adjective and you don't find the verb, right? It's talking about a property of Yahweh that holds just throughout time, right? It's a property of him, right? Not a property that he might have during a specific time, right? That's the distinction. And so that we would predict, right, is not allowed for with the verb, right? And you actually don't find any examples of that with the verb. Okay. So who cares about this? Like, why does it matter? What this tells us is that the only difference here, right, is in the categorizers, right? The root is the same, right? The only difference is whether the thing, the property is an adjective or a verb, right? And so that tells us something about, or it might tell us something, right, about this class of stative verbs, right, in call. It tells us that, maybe this class doesn't allow for states that are permanent. Okay. They're just like temporary states. So then you would have to say, okay, so what kinds of other verbs are in this class, right? And do they behave in the same way? And, how might they relate to adjectives, right, that are from the same root? Those are all questions, right, that you'd have to ask and answer. But the point is that this helps us. I mean, I've heard it claimed, right, that these two words are identical, right? They're just like completely replaceable. They're not. I mean, if you look very carefully at the context, you're not. There are some contexts where you just won't find the verb, and part of the thing is, right, that there's a massive amount of literature on this distinction between temporary states and permanent states, right? They're called stage level predicates versus individual level predicates, right? Those are the two terms. There's a guy named Gregory Carlson who introduced these terms in 1977 in a dissertation he wrote. Massive amount of work done on it. Okay, if you know that and you say, okay, maybe this could be the distinction, right? You can look at these contexts again and you can say, oh, look, like this actually fits, right? If you don't know that before, it's hard to know what you're looking for, right? What kinds of things would disallow, the adjective, and what kinds of things would disallow the verb? It would be really hard to know. But this is just a plug for reading more of the semantics literature in general. Hebrew is not that unique, or Greek is not. They're both not that unique, right? They're going to do a lot of the same things that other languages are going to do. This distinction holds across like all languages, right? Individual level predicates and stage level predicates. And it's very, very obvious, right? Saying something like, I'm hungry is different than saying like, I'm honest, right? It's just different kind of state. One is temporary, one is permanent. So the idea is just that you can take this, right, from the literature and say, okay, here's a category. Now I can look to see if this category matches the data. Sometimes it doesn't, right? You need to think again, and you need to come up with a new category. But a lot of times it will, because like I said, there's a lot of work that's been done on this. Okay, so let's go on to Greek. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pistis. I don't know who has read my article on the Pistis Christou debate thing. I'm going to talk about some of that, and then like some of my thoughts on like what Pistis actually means, which I didn't really like talk a lot about in that paper. I talked some about it, but we'll get more into it. Okay, so the first question, we're looking at a noun, right? How does Pistis relate to other words with the same root, right? So this is just a different question. Just thought it would be fun to answer. What are the arguments of Pistis, if any? Okay, so yeah, words that refer to both an event and thing with the is suffix. So you have this suffix is on the end, right? That seems to attach to a lot of nouns that are derived from verbs. So ktisis is from ktisdo, right? And it refers to the creation, right? Or the act of creating, right? Just like creation. So in many ways, this suffix is like the tion suffix in English, right? This does not mean that any noun with this is ending has this suffix, right? Just like you couldn't say that any noun with tion has the tion suffix in English, right? So a noun like nation, like presumably is not derived from a from another verb, right? Nating, you nated someone, right? It's probably not the case. But what you have is, I mean, the tion is probably just part of the root, okay? But now I think about it, it's probably related to native. Anyway, doesn't matter. The point is that you have things like polis, right? Where, okay, this suffix is there, that's fine, right? Well, it's really not a suffix, right? It's just that ending, right? But in other cases, it's pretty clear that it's a suffix that's attached to a verb, right? So like krisis is the same way, right? That's coming from krino, judge. And again, you can have it refers to either the noun or the thing that's created from the action of the verb, or the event itself. Okay. And again, like I said, deverbal nouns across languages are often systematically ambiguous. And a ton of work has been done on this. There's all kinds of other, like, basically whenever you derive a word from another word, right? The word that you're deriving from doesn't just go away, right? That's the idea. Okay. So whatever semantics you would apply to that word is going to affect the semantics of the word that you form. Okay. So, you have exam, examine, examination, right? All of those words are going to be related to each other. And each time you create a new word, you're going to, at least in some way, going to be relating it to the word that you're forming it from. Okay. So what's interesting, so this is, again, just like taken out of my paper. The noun pistis and the verb pisteo share the same argument realizations. So the idea is that, again, we talked about like the dative alternation in English, right? If you derive, even like throw, I made a throw. No, that's not a good one. It's interesting that in English it doesn't work nearly as well. I mean, so some nouns it works very well, and some nouns it doesn't. So like believe and belief in English works perfectly. Like the two noun, the noun and the verb are going to have the same kinds of argument realization patterns. So I believed in the president. I believe the president. I have belief in the president. I, my belief of the president is strong, right? Or something like that. So you can replace the noun with a verb and vice versa, right? So these are just some examples of how you can do the same thing with pistis and pisteo. So we have, in this example, the first example, those who do not believe the truth. So I have, believe the truth here. And then this is parallel to C, right? And piste aletheas, belief of the truth, right? So here you have the noun, here you have the verb, or really a participle. I don't think this is the best example, but I'll, if you want to, we can talk more about it later if you want. Then you have here the verb with the infinitive, eis auton pisteuin. And then here you have the same exact structure, eis Christon pisteos himon. So you have eis, right? And then a person, eis, and then a person. Here you have the noun, here you have the verb. Okay. So that tells us that it's probably something like ktisis, brosis, apocalypsis, right? All these words that can refer either to, or that share something in common with the verb, right? So the question then is, does species always have arguments? The answer is no. So here is an example where species does not have an argument. You can see this at the end. Polus te ochlos ton hiereon, hupekoun kuon te piste. Okay. And a great many of the priests became obedient. Okay. So obedient, right, to the faith. And here we don't have any argument for pistis. There's nothing syntactically that piste goes with, right? We don't have, again, very different than this, right? We have pisteos es Christon, right? We have the argument there. Here, there's nothing. So the point is, this is just like creation of a shirt, and the creation is rebelling against the creator, right? The creation is rebelling against the creator. When you have no argument, you have to have a different interpretation. The syntax is telling you, right? You have a different interpretation. Unless like Joseph mentioned earlier, right? We have a context where the argument is supplied, right? Like the vase hit the ground, right? Where we just understand the ground. Here it's pretty clear that, obedient to the faith in Jesus is probably not the case, right? If anything, it's the faith of, right? With the genitive, but it's not, te piste es Christon or something like that. So this is a different sense of the word, right? So you don't have the argument and you have a different sense. That's the idea. And so syntax is telling us something about the meaning. And this is exactly what I'm saying here, right? When you have pistis plus a genitive, it means something, right? Belief of something to be true. When you have pistis plus the dative or a preposition, it means something else. When you have pistis, without anything, right? Or with a different kind of genitive, it again means something. It can mean something different, right? So the point in this is that the way to tell what the meaning of the word is, right, is through syntax. You have to do your homework first, right, to figure out how syntax relates to the meaning. But once you do that, then you can go to a new context and say, okay, what does it mean? So I'll give you an example of how this hasn't been done thoroughly enough. Okay, so I don't know if you guys have read Matthew Bates's book Salvation by Allegiance Alone. His basic argument, right, is that pistis can mean allegiance, and it does mean allegiance in these kinds of contexts. So if you look at his examples, one of the ones he gives is 3 Maccabees 3:3, and it says, "But the Judeans were maintaining unswerving goodwill and faithfulness, pistis, right, toward pros, the kings." Well, it's interesting that you have here pros and not ace, right? So like in the New Testament, there's one example with pistis and pros. There are no examples with the verb and pros, none. So the one example here, right? But your faith in God has gone forth everywhere. I mean, it's really interesting, right? Just the difference in translation. Even here, this is Josephus, and fidelity, pistis, which he owed to Hyrcanus. I mean, very, very different translation. Fidelity to Hyrcanus versus, faith in God, right? Pistis, can take en or ace or pros. In the New Testament, we have this sole example of pros with pistis. So the question is, okay, so if you were to like argue with Matthew Bates, say like, okay, does it really mean allegiance? Like, the question would be, not does it really mean allegiance, but when does it mean that, right? And what kinds of syntactic contexts give you that meaning? Again, even in English, right? We say this all the time. Oh, believe in, not just believe, right? So if you say like, oh, I believe in whoever, it's different. We say it's different than it's just believing someone, right? And so the point is that these are not parallel examples, right? If you take this example in Josephus or this example in Third Maccabees and then compare it to examples in the New Testament where you have pisteo or pistis ace or n, right, is not necessarily the case that the same meaning you have in Josephus is going to carry over to the New Testament, because that meaning could be coming from the preposition pros, and you could get a different meaning with ace or n. Okay. Now, I actually, I don't think that's the case, but the homework that needs to be done here, and that if I ever have time to do it, what would hope to do, would be, you have to look and to see, okay, how is ace used, right, in these other kinds of contexts, right? Or are they used in these other corpora, these other kinds of contexts, and figure out why you have pros. In Josephus, like pros is way more common, and the bare dative is way more common, right? Why do you have those in those contexts, right? And why do you have ace in the New Testament? And then you have to say, okay, if they do mean the same thing, then we have to give us semantics to ace and pros that overlap in this instance, right? We know that they overlap sometimes, right? But the question is why would they overlap here, right? They don't necessarily overlap, but they could, right? Sign in and sign on both overlap, right? Again, Citibank has sign on, Capital One has sign in, right? It's perfectly fine. But if you were to do an analysis on it, right, you have to ask when those two things are identical, and then you'd have to look back at all the contexts, the pistis or pisteo ace, and say, okay, are these contexts the same as or similar to the ones in like Third Maccabees and in Josephus, where you have this meaning of fidelity or faithfulness, that's triggering this meaning, right? Are they the same? And then you might be able to say, okay, ace and pros are doing the same thing, right? That's the idea. Personally, I think like I can think of some examples where I do think ace and pros are doing the same thing, but I think it is more complex than it has been talked about thus far, is the short answer. Okay. Any questions? I know I've been just like kind of ignoring the chat. So I don't know if there are any sort of
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So your discussion about Tzaddik got me thinking about this question that I've been wrestling with yada in Hebrew, which is also some kind of stative notion, to know. And you mentioned in some chats that we've had that when it's in the participle, you might be able to make a case that it has a special nuance of like to care for someone. So, or like, at the end of Psalm 1, Yodea Adonai Derek Tzadikim. It's not that he's aware cognitively of their way. It's got to be saying something different. And then you have that proverb too, that the righteous cares for his behemah. It's like Yodea Behemato or something like that. And so could that be related to, and then you have this special nuance of Yada, Ish, Adam Yada, Et Ish, Ishto, something like this, right? Which is a very specialized kind of meaning, it seems like. So it made me think that maybe when it's with a finite verb, with an object, then we have some kind of stage level situation that's temporary, like an instance of knowing, maybe, or some in some sense, versus like this general characteristic of caring for, and then that likes to be in the progressive, the participle. I don't know. What do you think, or how does that strike you just hearing that possibility?
I think there's a correlation between these things, right? Because there are examples where yada has like a sort of eventive meaning. Let's just say like an eventive meaning, right? Care for, even, have intercourse with, right, is like an event. Okay, so it's not the case that a finite verb will always give you an eventive meaning, right? Because you have finite verbs with states, right? If I just say, the normal way to say I know, right, is yadati, right, and that's a finite verb. And that would be an individual level predicate. Like the like no is a prototypical individual level predicate, and one of the things that it disallows, like in English, is the progressive. Like I am knowing French is just bad, and so that's like that tells you, right, that yada. The question is, I mean, I think yada can be either, right? So the issue is what in the context and in like the syntactic context, right? So like the argument. So if you have a man subject to a woman object, right? It's eventive, right? I think probably a lot of it is coming from the object, right? Where you have if the object and the verbal form. So if you know something like French, it's an individual level predicate, right? That's like, so I can't think of an example in Hebrew, but like there are cases where like something to be true, or like a proposition, right? And in those cases, like you would have this individual level predicate, and then there are other cases where the thing that's known is something that is temporary, right? Or it's implied, that the thing known has an event associated with it, right? Like caring for animals, like or caring for people, for things that are in your care, right? So I think what you would then say is that you would say that yada means something broader than no, right, in English, and the verbal form and the object are going to help disambiguate whether no in Hebrew ends up being an individual level predicate or a stage level predicate. In English, it's just always individual, right? So again, it happens to be a difference between English and Hebrew, right? Where no in English is just not the same as yada in Hebrew. I'm sure if we knew the semantics of yada better, we would say, okay, like there's no reason why you couldn't do it that way, right? You couldn't have a verb that was individual level sometimes and stage level sometimes. There's other verbs like that, or at least other adjectives for sure. And it would just depend on the syntactic context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that you can have a verb like yada with a participle is already telling us something, isn't it? That
For sure.
it is different than to know in English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, that's where, again, like grammar is telling us something, right? And we need to listen to it. Because, I mean, again, you have to be very, very careful here, right? No is not the same as yada. The progressive in English is not the exact same as the participle in Hebrew. But the fact that you do have this, you do have, I am knowing, right, in Hebrew, but you don't have I am knowing in English, does suggest that there's something going on here, right? The difference could be in the semantics of the participle, right, versus the progressive in English, or the difference could be, between no and yada, and that's where that's what I would say is the difference. Any other questions, comments?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
One, is there a chance that the slides will be made available somewhere, like an email or something?
Yeah, for sure. Let me just write a note of that on my board.
I took lots of notes, but I was like, it looked very nice. So, and I write and forget. So,
yeah, I will tell Nick to do something about that.
Thanks. And second question, with your charting out of the different words and stuff, I'm currently doing that, comparing usages of shuv and naham. And so I was curious what all, like you mentioned there's a lot of categories that were blank in other categories. What would you recommend having? Like at the moment, I have the references, the number of usages, positive or negative, general use, result, used of who, tense, Septuagint, how they translate it, other notes. Would you add anything?
So my notes are like all about syntax, right? So it's all saying, okay, like what kinds of things shuv? So the question is like, can an inanimate thing shuv?
Right.
Right. Or do you always shuv to somewhere? What kinds of prepositions go with it? And then if you do always shuv somewhere, are you always going back to the like deictic center of the speaker, right? Which is how return is in English. Well, I don't know what return means in English. I have to think about that. I mean, yeah, that's actually not true. I'll just scratch that. Again, it's like, yeah, your first intuition about a word is probably wrong, right? Because they're way more complex. I can I returned a tarp this morning to Lowe's, right? So it's so you have to account for that example in English just as much as like I returned home.
Right.
So in Hebrew, right, those would normally be different, right? Because you'd have heshiv. So that would be the other thing is like the binyan system and how like if you are you doing like the verb in a specific binyan or the root?
That's a great question, and I don't actually know the answer to it. I was finding usages on Blue Letter Bible, and I know for Shuva has like 1,108 usages or something like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. So you would have to be like pretty careful about that.
Yeah.
Just, again, distinguishing between those two things. The question would be like, okay, like if I were to like kind of exhaustively analyze a word, I would say like you have to look at all of the words that root can form, right? You just say, okay, like because words like certain classes of words will form, or certain classes of roots will form some words and not other words, right? I won't get into this, but what I would do is and then adjuncts, right? So like any like temporal phrases or the specific verb form that's used, like all those things, all the grammatical information, notes about the subject, the places, right? Can you return to a person or a place or both? Like all those things are relevant for what the word actually means. And then what I would try to find is words that behave in a similar way. So see if you can put that word into a class of sorts. Words that have the same binyan like the same like roots that form the same verbs in the same binyanim, right? That's like not every word will do that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Is that a kind of a starting point?
Yeah, that's good. I've been like charting out a bunch of stuff, and I'm about to go back through and list out all of the things. So I was like, I should find out what else I need to include.
Yeah. You have to be careful because like if you do too much, then it's like, it's not really helpful.
Yeah.
Like if you know the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, he just does like way too much. Like I mean, it's great. I mean, I go there all the time, right? Okay. So I'm very appreciative of his exhaustiveness, but it's a little bit annoying sometimes that I have to scroll through like shuv, for example, every single subject is listed. Okay. Yeah. So like the fact that David can shuv and Moses can also shuv doesn't tell me anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care, right? But what is significant is that they're animate, right? So right, they're people, right? If an animal can shuv, that's also interesting to me, right? But all I want is one example, right? I want. Okay, this verb allows animate subjects, right? And this verb allows inanimate subjects, and then like, great, like that's what I need to know, right? And so the point is that what you need to be looking for are, you can't be too fine grained, right? You need to be looking for the meaning components that are grammatically relevant, right? Animacy is grammatically relevant. It's going to affect the syntax, right? It's going to affect like how things are interpreted. Whether like Moses and David don't affect that, right? Whatever that distinction is, doesn't matter. And so that's what you need to be looking for. Like locations are grammatically relevant, right? Word order, right? Those things are relevant to your analysis. I hope that's kind of answers the question.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Hi, can I ask another question?
Yep.
All right. So you just mentioned, several things that would be relevant. What are some resources? And I haven't seen the last 2 podcast episodes, so you might have recommended some of these things already. But what are some resources you would recommend to just figure out different syntactical categories that are going to be relevant in the analysis of semantics?
Yeah, it's really a bummer that I don't have like a place to point you to where it's like, oh, these are the kinds of things. The problem is, people work on different things and you kind of just have to like read a bunch of the literature to figure out like, okay, this is relevant, this is not relevant, but I would say like a good place to start is a book called Argument and Realization by Malka and Beth Levine. For verbs, like, it's great. It's like a broad overview of the literature. It's a little dated. It's written in 2005, but it's a great place to start. Most of the work on this has been done in about verbs, right? Because they are like the most like grammar heavy, in the sense that they they're just kind of the backbone of a clause, right? For nouns, like the biggest thing is mass versus count, right? And then there's all kinds of nuances within that domain. Okay. So if you wanted to start there, Kirkia has Gennaro Kirkia, he has a paper on mass and count nouns across languages. It will be like difficult, but it might give you some references, right? Especially to like kind of get your feet wet into how different languages do like mass and count nouns. Adjectives, it's all about scales. Scales and adjectives are like, that's what it's about. So the place, the big guy that has done a ton of work on scales is a guy named Chris Kennedy. Basically, so Chris Kennedy and Lewis McNally have a paper in 2005. I forget what it's called. Let me just see really quick. It's on my computer somewhere. If you just look on Google Scholar, it has like a ton of scale structure, degree modification, is it, and the semantics of gradable predicates. Okay. So that's scale structure, degree modification, and the semantics of gradable predicates. So verbs are actually highly relevant in that as well. Verbs like straighten, lengthen, those are all formed from adjectives. So the meaning of the verb is highly dependent on the semantics you give to the adjective. So that kind of covers like the three main, nouns, verbs, adjectives. But again, it's like, it's really, I can't really say, like I mentioned on a previous podcast, I think maybe about like inalienably possessed objects. So that's the kind of thing. It's like, okay, like you're just gonna run into that, if you read a lot. But I can't really think of a place where it's like, oh, here's like a list of all the grammatically relevant, sorts of things you want to know when you're doing lexical semantics. So hopefully that's a helpful place to start, though.
Oh, it's excellent. And another question, this is more about just semantics in general and senses, is I've heard the words thrown around and you can kind of tell what they mean, but what is the difference between monosemy and polysemy, and what does that mean about senses of words, or is that just a whole other can of worms that you don't want to open?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know exactly where you're seeing those terms, but the difference between those two words are just like one sense versus many senses, right? So
yeah, I think it was just some stuff written by Stan Porter, kind of defending monosemy over polysemy, and that's all I know.
Okay, so I don't know that literature as well, so just gotta keep that in mind. So I don't want to say anything about what he is saying. I will say that in the semantics literature, like the push, right, or like the part of the, like, what people are trying to do is figure out what the contribution of a particular morpheme is, right? And the assumption is that if you can reduce the amount of senses, that's a better analysis, right? So if you can account for, like, for yada, for example, right? If you can account for all the uses of yada to know in Hebrew, with one sense, and then how that sense combines with different contexts, right? Different verbal forms and etc. Right? That's a better analysis than just listing all the possible interpretations, right? So this is a bit of a tension between cognitive linguistics and generative linguistics, where like people who hold to generative grammar in general will push for monosemy. They're not going to admit like every word only has one sense, right? No one would say that. What they would say is that what we're trying to do is come up with a meaning for these morphemes that fits in every context, right? That's what we're trying to do when we're doing semantics. Whereas in cognitive linguistics, like a lot of times, what an analysis is a listing of all the different contexts in which a word is used, right? I mean, I personally think like it is, just from like a theory perspective, it's better to account for things, based on based on context, right? Not like, don't just like list all the possible interpretations. Like, it's not that helpful. Like, what's helpful is to say, okay, here's one sense, and here's how we can get to the different interpretations. And so that would be what I would like try to push for. But again, part of that is how you define polysemy to begin with, because some people's definition of polysemy can just is very close to monosemy anyway, depending on how you define sense, right? Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
So based off of that, I think that same podcast you just mentioned. Looking at pistis. Another thought that I had was not only the types of arguments, but the arguments themselves. It can like change the way we define a word. So what I mean is, like, if I say I believe in you versus I believe in God, the same arguments used, but there's a different meaning there. And so as I'm looking through this, I can't find any examples in of like the I believe in you, something that has like, and maybe that's not a Greek distinction. I think you know what I mean by that phrase. Do you know if there's anything like that, that same analog?
In Greek?
Yes.
So the problem is in English, like, okay, so like if the problem is that I believe in English, can mean a lot of different things, depending, like you said, depending on the argument. So if I said I believe in flying pigs, right? You believe that they exist, right? If I said I believe in, I don't know, all these like bad things kept popping into my head. But if I said I believe in abortion, right? You would say that would mean that I believe that is okay, right? Or I believe in the right to life, right? Would mean that that I believe that this is the way the world should be, right? This is the way that the laws should be governed, right? If I said I believe in the senator, right? Then my belief is that the senator can accomplish something, right? So these, like, in each of these cases, there are different kinds of modals in English, right? So believing in flying pigs means that they exist, right? It's existential modal. Believing in the senator is ability, or like circumstantial modal. Believing in like the right to life or abortion would be the deontic modality, the way the world should be, right, based on rules or the proper rules, right? So the question would be: is in Greek, does this even apply, right? Like is it even? I don't know. Like, I don't know of contexts like where you have something like I believe in flying pigs, like pistewo and flying pigs. Like, I don't think that's the case. Which would just mean, if it wasn't the case, it would just mean that like believe in is just a poor translation, right? At the very least, it would mean that believe in is broader than pistewo en. And the problem with that is that when you have these contexts that talk about believing in God, right, the normal interpretation in English is whether I believe he exists, right? Because that's our semantics. It's just like I believe in flying pigs, right? So I mean, honestly, a lot of work needs to be done on this in Greek. One of the problems is that in the New Testament, our data set is so small, right? And we just have like, it's so rare that we have another argument there besides like God or Jesus, right? So it's just almost like Christon, right? The Christ, or like es theon, right? And so it's just like, it doesn't tell me anything if I have all these contexts that are the exact same or so close, right? So the part of the, like, what you need to do is go outside of the corpus and say, okay, what kinds of things can, pisteuo es go with, and then figure out, just like what, how that semantics might relate to believe in, right? My like, what I like currently think is that it is closer to be faithful to, right? But it's very difficult to tell sometimes in some contexts whether that's correct or not without more data. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Follow up if
there's work to be done. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. There's so many questions running through my head. But I guess a summary of what I would ask is, if you were to do a part 2 to your Pistis Christou article, are there any topics that you would expand upon? Or like, let's say it had been turned into a monograph and you weren't limited by by your journal. Are there any things that you would have wanted to expand upon more?
So once I have time, like, the next thing to do in that whole topic is just like give a real meaning to pistis and pisteuo and figure out how they're related to the adjective pistos. So that's the, like, I didn't give a meaning for those words. And so that is like, kind of next on the books as far as like what I will do with that topic. I mean, I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on it. Just that is, just like more linguistically robust. So even pistis and pistos, right? How those two are related. Like the fact that you can translate pistis sometimes as faithfulness, right? I mean, in English tells us something, right? Like in that case, faithfulness is a de-adjectival noun, right? Faithful, right? Is an adjective, and then ness turns it into a noun, right? So if we were to just like analyze everything in that way, then we could say that, I mean, maybe, right, that maybe pistis is derived from the adjective, or maybe it's just derived from the root, right? That is a stative root. There's all kinds of questions that aren't answered right now in my mind. So yeah, that would be the thing, is like figuring out what those three words mean and how they're related to each other would be the big task.
Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? How does pistikos genuine come about? Yeah, I mean, that's another another question of just like, what is that suffix doing, right? I mean, I think that in that case, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you like, I mean, yeah, in that case, you have a different argument structure, right? You're not genuine to someone, at least not normally. I mean, you'd have to check it with pistikos in Greek. This is from the chat. But you are pistos to someone. So in that sense, it's pistos and pisteuo are closer together in pistis, right? Because they all have these arguments that are related. And yeah, you would for sure want to figure out how that is related to those kinds of words as well. Any other final questions, comments?
I was wondering too, like, I wonder how much Hebrew, the Greek translation of the Hebrew ha'amin be, is influencing the way the New Testament structures that the syntax of the Greek there. I don't.
Yeah.
Did you run into thinking sometimes maybe that it was influenced by that whole?
I
structure?
haven't thought of that. So it could be. It's really hard to. I mean, yeah, those arguments are really hard to prove. And I think it would be way more likely. I just don't think it would be that likely in Paul, right? Or like Acts. And you have, I mean, you just, I mean, I like it. It feels like Paul and Luke are like native speakers of Greek, right? You could make a case to say, some of the other like authors of the New Testament are not native speakers, in which case, like, they'd be more likely influenced by, their native language. But it would be pretty unlikely, I think, that if Greek was Paul's native language, that he would then be influenced by Hebrew syntax. It'd probably go the other way around. Even if he had both in him, like natively, then I you would assume, that his Greek would still be, it would still reflect a native speaker and wouldn't be influenced by that. So I don't know. But that's an interesting point.
But for sure, outside of the New Testament corpus and outside of religious, like Jewish religious context, you have this structure of pistevo is.
Yeah, you have it in Josephus.
Okay. Well, if it's
a
native Greek structure, then we shouldn't be worried that the Hebrew would be interfering, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's just hard to know. It's just like why in the New Testament is it so distinctive? That's what it feels like, right? And then it's just a weird. There's just like it seems like it's something. So there's something going on in the New Testament, but I don't know what it is. So the other point is like pisteo es Christon, right? What does it mean to believe in the Messiah if the person who is the Messiah is in question, right? Does it mean just to believe that he is the Messiah, right? Or does it mean to be faithful to the Messiah, right? That's where I think like Bates's argument is not nearly nuanced enough, because I don't know the answer to that question. Like, can you to believe in the king when whoever the king is up in the air? Can it mean I believe that he is the king, right? I don't know. But that's a really important question if we want to figure out what es Christon means in these contexts, because this is exactly the kind of issue, that would affect how we interpret that phrase.